Welcome to Recruiting.work, a place to connect, communicate, and collaborate on all things recruitment. This session is brought to you by Outmatch. Just as Recruiting.work brings people in the talent community together, Outmatch brings recruitment technologies together, combining assessments, video interviewing, and reference checking software. They're creating a more holistic, more human hiring experience. Learn more at outmatch.com. All right, let's jump right into it. Thank you, everybody, for attending another episode in the Recruiting.work community called Let's Talk Recruiting, where peer practitioners across the industry all get together to talk about various topics, all relevant to our daily lives. Today is one where I think we all live in on a daily basis, and that's pipeline management. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about utilizing assessments in the screening process. When I did a survey when people signed up, sort of asking who uses assessments and who doesn't, at least in regards to the audience members, is about a 50-50 split. So I was kind of surprised to see it at 50, which is a good thing, I think. With us today, before I jump into the panelists, one quick housekeeping item for all the audience members. It's in the chat area. And specifically, if you go into the chat area, I encourage any and all comments, questions, or anything that you want to say to put that in the chat area. But before you do that, if you go into that chat section at the bottom, there's a drop-down menu that Zoom has default to say to all panelists. I just need everybody to change that to say all panelists and attendees. So that way everybody gets to engage in the conversation, not just the panelists. So again, change that drop-down menu in the chat area to say all panelists and attendees. So with that said, today our panelists are made up of Mark Wolin out of Dallas, Simone Press out of Los Angeles, Stephen Rosenblum out of Chicago, and Roseanne Donahue out of New York City. And I, of course, am also outside of the Los Angeles area myself. So again, topic, utilizing assessments in the screening process. Mark, can we go to you to have us kick off the conversation?
Yes, Sean, thank you very much. My name is Mark Wallen. As you mentioned, I'm at SiriusXM in Pandora. I've been here a little bit over 10 years now. Focused around the technical recruiting side. So I'm a senior manager for technical recruiting at the company. Specific to this topic on utilizing assessments in the screening process, I think it's very important to make sure that that you have a good scope and what the purpose, format, and the type of assessments are. So as it relates to me and what I work on, I make sure to, in my intake, we have different tools that we can utilize throughout the process, whether it's an initial screening or it's a part of the core interview, maybe some type of live coding, just making sure that it is tied to the actual need and that we relay that need to the actual candidates, because especially engineers, they're tested constantly, and it's not something they're always happy to do. And so making sure that your messaging back to the candidate is appropriate and why it's needed for your particular position, I think that's very important. So I think the context, both with the need from the management side, as well as that message being communicated back to the candidate, is very important.
Mark, is your messaging triggered by your ATS, or is this the recruiting team sending more of a personalized message to, hey, here's the test we need you to take?
Yeah, so personally, I like to do it one by one on my side. I believe most of my team and across the enterprise does it the same way, but our ATS is built out where, like, say for internship roles where we get a lot of applications, we can send it directly through our ATS as well.
And where are you triggering the assessment in the interview funnel? Is it after a recruiter phone screen or after a hiring manager? What's sort of the trigger point for you?
Yeah, it depends on the type of role, but most often we try to incorporate it during the actual interview process, because I'm sure you're aware there's some sketchy legal ground about when you can have an assessment throughout the process and which state you're in. So we try to do it as a part of the core interview, or at least some part of the first initial phone interview.
Is it a do on your own time, or is it do it in front of somebody watching you type situation?
It's also both. So depending on the manager, some managers like to send, after a first phone interview, they like to send a problem set that they expect returned within a day or two. Other times we utilize a tool called CodeBunk for real-time live coding. So we do both as well. And that's across even non-technical roles as well.
Is it just your tech roles that get assessments, or do you have different types of assessments or different type of roles?
Yeah, we don't do any personality indexing that I know some companies do, but we do, like marketing has certain assessments that are more relevant to them. So we do have across the organization, whether it's technical recruiting or G&A, there's different assessments that we do utilize.
For the other panelists too, what type of assessments are you doing? Is it kind of role specific, or is it a general, or is it kind of hit or miss depending upon the rec or role?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think I'm a big believer of assessments, and I think that assessments are really necessary outside of just tech. Mark had mentioned that over at his company, they are focusing in on assessments for marketing. I think it's all about sort of the hiring manager, and I think that that's really, just when you are building out a structured interviewing process, and when you have that initial call with your manager, whatever hiring manager you're working with, I think it's a really, really important time to figure out, obviously, the timing of that assessment. I think it's really important to understand and building out sort of a benchmark for that assessment. You can't really have an assessment without having a sense of what the best assessment would look like, right? So if you're asking someone to put together, for example, public relations role, right? If you're asking someone to put out a pitch or a press release, a theoretical press release that they're writing, you really want your manager to have a sense of what that press release should have in it. So a rubric for grading, because I think that that's sometimes the biggest issue. I mean, it's easy for tech, right? Because tech on some level, you send someone a test, they do the test, they send it back to you. You have a sense on, I mean, it's like music, right? Like you kind of know when the music's going to sound good and when it's not going to sound good. With a lot of these other sort of nuanced non-tech areas, marketing, PR. I mean, for example, I'm hiring a recruiting coordinator at the moment, and I sent someone an assessment yesterday, and I wanted her to build out an email template that she would put together for a certain kind of interview with multiple touch points. I think it's a really great, sort of tool to use to really understand fundamentally whether a candidate can do the job. And I think that, like, Amazon, for example, I worked there for a number of years, and Amazon does a writing assessment. They have, since begun to tweak that writing assessment to make it more nuanced for specific roles. But I think it's really key to understand, and build out a rubric with your hiring manager for what an assessment, how an assessment should be graded, for sure.
Are you leaving that kind of the hiring managers, or are you kind of consulting in that?
It's a consulting moment, right? Like, I think, I have a sense of what's worked in the past based on anecdotal, experience and my own experiences working with various candidates. They have a sense of what this role will involve on a day-to-day basis. You sort of sit down and really build it out with them. And there might even be several iterations. We've had, for example, where I'm currently, which is WIT Media, we are sort of a product company along with a software company. So I've sat down with the head of product to figure out the best assessment. I've sat down with the project managers to figure out the best sort of assessment that we send. I think the other thing that we should talk through is when people are sending assessments, it's really important to have a strong understanding of time and response, right? For us, as the ones grading it, but also just for the candidate, we don't want a candidate to spend, one of them, 7 hours and then another candidate to spend 3 hours. It's really important, if we're trying to have a structured interview process, if we're trying to mitigate bias, we need to be really standardized in our approach when it comes to assessments. So I think that as long as you're really sort of level-headed and really even-handed in the way that you get those assessments out there, and if you're really consultative with your partners, it's the very best way to measure if someone can do the job.
So I saw a question in the chat regarding setting that benchmark that Simone was talking about. Different assessment tools and different assessment companies do that differently, right? Some of them have, this is the assessment and the scoring for a marketing person. And this is one for a PR person versus a pure analyst, or whatever the case might be. Some of them build, so somebody was asking about homemade assessments, right? Homemade benchmarks. Some of the assessment tools that are out there ask you who are your top performers, right? If you have the ability to do that. And then they have the top performer take the assessment, and that is their benchmark for top performers in that role.
That's a great idea.
To continue using that. As far as timing is concerned and when's best to do it, I've worked for organizations where they only do it after someone interviews. I've done it where they attach it right away. Like Mark was saying, someone applies for the position, boom, it kicks out an assessment. One of the things you want to think about when you're timing it is perhaps what the cost is for that assessment, right? If you're paying a lump sum for unlimited assessments and you're comfortable and legally based on where the position is and how you're using it company-wide, you might want everybody who applies to that position to automatically get the assessment and it doesn't cost you anything extra. If you're paying on a per assessment basis, you might want to be a little bit more frugal and watch when you're having people take that assessment and only give it to people who you're seriously interested in. Another thing I wanted to mention, and I know this might not be your plan, Sean, but sorry, is around using it. And, we're all talking, and Simone mentioned the word tool, right? And someone posted in the chat feature as well that they got turned down based on their assessment. It's important, I think, that organizations use the assessment as a data point, as one of the tools that they're using, right? If listen, I'm glad everybody applied, I'm going to give them an assessment, and either they're going to be red or they're going to be green. Done, right? If the person scores from here to here, I move them forward. If they don't, then I don't move them forward. Well, there may be a great candidate who has absolutely fantastic experience and could really do well, and they take the assessment and they don't do well, right? Or it says for this role, they're a 20% fit, and I'm only looking for people who are an 80% fit. It might still be worthwhile, even though that they didn't score well on that assessment, to still have a conversation with them. Because an assessment should not be, in my opinion, an immediate pass-fail, but it should be part of the package that you're looking at for candidates.
Generally speaking, is it kind of a pass-fail, especially around like a tech or a skills assessment?
A skills assessment, either you have it or you don't, right? Either you're able to, if we're looking for somebody who can do the functions of this job and the assessment shows that they cannot do the functions of that job, you need to compare them with other people from a functionality perspective. But a lot of what people are hiring for is not only can they do the skills of the job, but are they a fit for the organization, a fit for the team, a fit for the manager, and often different assessments can help evaluate that as well.
Yeah, and also I would say that a lot of roles have a ton of ambiguity. I mean, products these days, everyone's got a different perspective and there's no yes or no answer. I mean, these aren't binary choices most of the time. These are like, all right, well, this person has this to select from, this person has this to select from. So again, it's so incredibly important to have a benchmark because as people have mentioned in the chat, you get to this point where if you don't know what you're looking for and you make all these people do work, not only do you have a terrible candidate experience because you haven't even talked about how to give feedback after someone's done an assessment, but like you have to be really clear on what we're actually ultimately going for. These personality indexes, yeah, it's great in theory. The jury's really still out on whether they work. And the other thing is when you go to these personality indexes and these cognitive indexes, I think it becomes really difficult because some of this is like a person's person, it's not like a function of like skill set or their way of doing stuff with regard to work. Suddenly we're understanding how they think and how they make decisions. And when you kind of veer into that area, how are we really using the tool or how are we using it as a tool to mitigate bias when in theory we're on some level criticizing what they're doing like as people, right? So it's a very thin line and you have to be really prescriptive, I think, in your approach.
Roseanne, you use a lot of behavioral indexing, right? Predictive indexing.
Yes. Yep.
Well, what do you think around the comparison, sort of what some of the points that Simone just brought up around behavioral? And I will add real quick onto this around behavioral assessments. My very first job in recruiting, kind of what we talked to earlier about matching up to a top level employee. My first job at a recruiting agency is how I got my start in here. And that was the test. They had their top 2 recruiters, took a psych test. You came in, you did a face-to-face 30-minute conversation with the recruiting manager, took the test, you matched, you're in. And that sort of was the whole hiring process. Yeah. But yeah, Roseanne, around behavioral piece of it, can you add on there?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So we do use predictive index. We've been using it for about 2.5 years. And the reason why we started using it is we were actually seeing a lot of turnover in our sales organization. And what we like about PI is it's measuring what drives a person. So there's really no right or wrong answer per se. We basically, to the earlier points, had some of our top performers do the assessment themselves, as well as had other, stakeholder input. So, hiring managers and other internal stakeholders, we create the job target. And then I love the software. Basically, we'll match the person against the job target, and we'll tell you kind of how they fit in terms of what drives the person. So it's measuring their dominance, their extroversion, their patience, and their formality. And we actually really like it. The software produces a lot of tools that we use in the hiring process. We started sending it right after the HR interview so that the manager has the report and the tools, because it actually gives you a tailored interview guide, a coaching guide, other management resources. You can also create a relationship guide, and it will kind of show you, for example, like how the candidate compares to the hiring manager style. But again, it's not the end all be all. It's not the final decision maker. It is just another tool to help in the assessment process. And it really has helped us because we were able to do a deep dive analysis to see some trends. So, what are our top performers looking like? What does their PI look like? And what are some of the lower performers looking like? And then we also rolled it out to the existing employee population within sales as a communication and developmental tool. So I was able to bundle all those resources for the employees and the managers, and they were able to use it as part of their performance management process. So we really like it.
What's the software called?
Predictive index.
Okay, got it.
And it's basically based, the package price is based on employee headcount. So they'll give you a quote based on, your headcount, and it's, as many assessments that you want to send. There's no pay per assessment.
So to piggyback on Roseanne, to utilize, so assessments can be utilized for different reasons, right? Certainly from a pre-employment perspective, but also, as she pointed out, from a performance management perspective and learning and development for that individual, but also something I want to talk about was succession planning, right? So same from an internal recruiting perspective, to have existing employees. And I don't know if someone needs to have all their employees take the assessment, but certainly those that may be interested in advancement opportunities to take the assessment tool, and same thing to match them against other positions within the company to not only see their qualifications, but also, to Roseanne's point, their gaps, right? So if somebody has a goal to move from an administrative to a managerial position, and you have an assessment set up and benchmarked to that manager position, you can have the associate take that assessment, look and see where they need some learning and development and gap closure, to then consider them for that managerial position to help them get into that role and be successful there. So I'm a big believer that if you have the ability to use those assessments, that it's not just about pre-employment, but it's also about future advancement and development of the individuals.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, like, in terms of just how it works, right? So, I mean, I'm very passionate about, the notion of diversity and inclusion. And I think from a diversity standpoint, especially early on in the process, it's really important to kind of be open to a wide variety of profiles. When you, for example, are looking at, your sales organization, looking at top performers and saying, okay, they're all like reds. So like, clearly there's a trend here, in theory, right? And then you kind of move to the pipeline and you start sending out the tests, and suddenly there's a predisposition to pushing people through who have that red, for example, assessment. I guess my thought process here is, do you then have to build in, some sort of number of people who are greens who might be interesting, so folks who are maybe more introverted? Has there been sort of thought around that early on in the pipeline, or is that something that hasn't really
So we at Radware, we don't disqualify candidates based on their assessment because it's just another data point to use, and it highlights where the candidate, what areas they may not be a match, and then the manager can use those questions to drill down further. I don't think we've ever just, said, no, you're not being considered because of their score. It just gives more information and more questions to ask to probe deeper on the areas that they may not be strong on. So for us, it works, and it hasn't been an issue, and it's not a time test. It takes, 5 to 10 minutes. We haven't had any candidates push back on it. They're pretty happy to take it. And then when we do hire them, we share the reports with them, and everyone is like really surprised to see how super accurate it is. And it really is. Even, for myself, when I took it, I couldn't believe how accurate it was.
So not to just harp on predictive index, because there are many great assessment tools that are out there, right? Some really, really great ones. To her point about, also, I like sharing the report with an employee, not with a candidate, right? But with an employee, especially if that will tell them some more information about themselves. And some of the tools, to Roseanne's point about relationships, it talks about how to better work with other people, right? So for managers to have their own assessments, to be able to see how better to manage and work with their teams, but also for the manager to have the assessments for their team, because different people, right, work differently with each other. And it could also give recommendations for the manager on how to better relate, how to get better results, and so forth with members of their team.
Yeah. Question for Mark around the tech side. Do you ever do behavioral assessments for technical positions?
Yeah, I was actually going to chime in. So we don't as much on the technical side, and I think an important point to Roseanne and Simone's questioning as well is that if you are going to have some type of behavioral, you just need to make sure it's a data point and it's not a part of the actual decision, because there is a lot of gray legal ground there and what you can and cannot do, especially as it relates to D&I and some of those initiatives. And so, no, it's mainly the assessments that we utilize on the tech side are relevant to the position and they have a desired outcome. So whether it's a live coding problem or some type of problem solving statement to work through, it is relevant to the job. And so not as much the behavioral side, just we try to steer away from that a little bit because, again, some of that borderline legal ground.
Steve had mentioned, I have a question actually. Steve had mentioned, not sharing it with candidates. I recently, I think within the last 6 months, went through a process, and someone sent me a predictive index. And then actually, it was really interesting from a candidate experience perspective. They were actually like, so do this thing, it'll take 5, and it was the predictive index, by the way. I just looked it up, but they were like, oh, do this quick test for us. It was for a head of talent acquisition role, right? So they were like, do this quick test for us. We want to kind of see where you show up. And then, the benefit is that we'll actually share the results with you as a candidate. So you'll walk away, and if you invest 10 minutes, you'll get something out of it. You'll get this fun little report that tells you about your personality. And to Roseanne's point, it was actually spot on, but curious, is there anything weird about sending it to candidates? Because I feel like people have, and Red Bull, by the way, I don't know if anyone's worked at Red Bull previously, but I remember maybe 2 years ago, I applied for a job at Red Bull. And before I even talked to someone, and I thought that this was actually not the best candidate experience. I mean, we can go on for hours about how candidate experience is completely something that is forgotten about by recruiters. But interestingly enough, Red Bull, I had this interaction with them where they sent me a test to do. I never heard back from the team, right? But they obviously, saw that I was interesting enough to potentially do the test, did the test. I got this really amazing report. It was really interesting. But coming out of that process, from a candidate experience perspective, is it cool to send it to people? I think most people will like to see it, right? Even if they don't get a job, as long as there's some sort of commitment or conversation, about the job. So you don't feel like you're doing something for no reason,
So here's my thought on sharing a report with a candidate. It cannot be or should not be a match to the job, right? You don't want to say, oh, you're a great fit for the job based on these, benchmarking percentages or what have you. And by the way, you're not picked, right? Because then that causes more questions. But from a detailed and information about themselves, right? I think it's a great great tool to have. To Mark's point about from a technical perspective, we all talk about the candidate experience, right? And gosh, how long does it take for me to apply for this position, right? And if it takes me 2 minutes, you get, maybe more people. If it takes me 20 minutes, there's the drop-off points, right? So I'm sure part of Mark's job is to track and see where people are falling off in the funnel process. And sometimes to have that assessment tool, depending on the assessment tool, if the assessment's going to take me a half hour to complete, I may be like, forget it. I'm not going to, I just want to get my name in the talent pipeline. I don't have time right now to sit here for a half hour and take an assessment unnecessarily or due to the time that it takes. Mark, what's your thought on timing and the amount of time that it can take candidates?
Yeah, that is definitely correct. I mean, engineers for a lot of the part, since we mainly recruit software engineers, are very much in demand, and they don't have to spend a couple of hours in your interview process if they don't want to. And in some cases, you see even the application process. If your application is too long, you get a third filled out, and they're like, "Oh, I'm done with this. I'm going to just go somewhere else." So it is the same thing with assessments. If they don't find the value add, or if they're not really tuned into your company, it may not be something that's going to help your process. And to Simone's point, I think candidate experience is extremely vital for all positions, but even more so for engineering, just because they always have multiple job opportunities. And so for like sending a follow-up on their results, I think that's a good candidate experience long-term. So, hey, unfortunately, we're not moving forward right now, but at least you come away with this, and I'd love to maintain contact long-term. We've all heard the horror stories of candidate experience, and you don't want to be the recruiter that's pinned as such.
Does anybody know of an assessment where, let's say I took a coding test and I took it with the same vendor that another company that I applied to uses? Do I have to retake the test, or as a candidate, can I carry an assessment with me wherever I go? Or is it owned by the employer? I've never seen it like that, but I always thought it made sense to have that. Has anyone ever seen anything you can carry your assessment?
I feel like LinkedIn is trying to do that with those skills assessments, right? Like a little bit, like they're not, I mean, it's not perfect at all, but like LinkedIn is like trying to push this whole agenda of like L&D, and they're like, okay, do this assessment once, and then you can have it featured in your profile. That's the only thing I've seen that mirrors that.
Yeah, same here. It's funny. I got asked to take an assessment to which I was the administrator at another company. So I'm like, gosh, will I be able to cheat on this? Am I going to be able to get the results I want? Right. So, but I haven't seen, other than LinkedIn, like Simone mentioned, exactly. I haven't seen where there's the sharing. I have had applicants who said, here's my report. Can I just send it to you? Right. Here's one I took at another company. Can I just attach it with my resume or my application, and you can look at it, so you have more information on me. One was that for the particular company and applicant, we weren't using that assessment tool, right? But it was another data point, kind of like somebody sharing their portfolio, right? Or their certification transcript, or whatever the case might be.
Well, yeah, and on that note, specific to, especially on the contract agency side in tech, like your tech systems of the world, they'll always send some type of standardized test result for the candidates that they're presenting over. So yeah, depending on which side of the fence that you're on, it is something that you can utilize just more proactively.
I hire a ton of engineers, and I found it really interesting because I think that there's been a slight shift in the way that testing is being done, both in terms of where it happens in the funnel, and also just the type of experience the candidates go through. So I've seen, I mean, at least and this was a number of roles that I've had in the past, but there's a lot more of this. It's not a whiteboard. It's not this scenario where you're sitting there taking a coding test, but it's actually an architecture discussion. And I think that that's something that we'll probably be moving to as these roles become a lot more nuanced and ambiguous, because it's one thing if you're hiring a junior software developer, right? You need to know if they can do Python and like SQL. But if you're looking at more of these senior roles, I hired a head of data engineering, for example, recently, and a number of different solutions architects roles. And it's a conversation. Like, let's talk through this problem. How would you theoretically solve it? And that's where I circle back to the idea of benchmarking as such a fundamentally important thing, because again, suddenly, you're getting into this gray area of like, well, I think that this is good and I think that's good. You need some really strong understanding of what you're finding. Has anyone found that, just this like more conversational style and approach to software engineering testing?
So we do for our technical support engineers and our security analysts an actual lab test. So prior to COVID, they would literally come into the office and do the hands-on, like in the environment, like solve this problem,
Wow.
to kind of test, their research abilities and, their technical aptitude. And now we do it virtually, because of COVID. So that is administered by one of the senior, technical managers, and based on how they do this, lab test, that's pretty much like a go no go that they meet the technical requirements.
Yeah, and to the conversational aspects. So if you're going to have those type of assessments within the interview process, you just need to make sure that the hiring manager and the team are on the same page as far as the desired outcomes and the approach, so that you don't have bias from one developer that would do it one way and then another team member that does it another way. You just need to make sure there's certain areas. Hey, here's the direction we would like them to go. Here's an acceptable area. This is definitely not acceptable. So I think making sure everyone's on the same page is equally important.
From a developer assessment piece, do you guys have your existing employees take tech evaluations or coding tests before it goes out to applicants, or at any point?
Yeah, we did when we evaluated tools. So a couple of years ago, when we evaluated HackerRank and several others, we did have a select group of folks that were testing them to see level of difficulty, if they felt that it was appropriate to the types of roles that we hired. But we don't do that on an ongoing basis. It was really just to see which tools we wanted to utilize.
I just think when my kids bring up me the new math stuff and ask for help, like, I don't know new math. I can tell you my way. So it goes back to, hey, could I test out of 5th grade math these days, or 8th grade math? Question for, still continuing with the employee stuff. So if you're doing assessments, technical or non-technical, is it important that you're applying those same tests to employees that are already there to kind of have that bench? Or is it just, hey, if you want to, you can, if you don't, you don't? But how important is that to apply these type of assessments to your existing employee base? Even if it's just a few top performers, just is that important in it? I'll open that to anybody. Do people give you this to?
I'll chime in. Yeah, I would say it's very important, because if you're going to be requiring folks coming into the company to take such a thing, I think it's important to see how well matched it is to your actual need. Otherwise, it's just an irrelevant tool that you're using throughout the process, and you need to make sure each assessment is specifically targeted against your actual need. So if the current team and your top performers do not find it relevant, it's probably not a tool that you want to utilize.
I'm just thinking, like, in regards to internal mobility, which has been popping up recently. Like if I'm giving assessments to my potential new employees, but my internal employees want to be moving up internally, do they kind of have to sync in some way? And would that help the recruiting team recruit internally if they have that option too?
I totally agree. And I think that, it depends on the size of the organization. I mean, I've been at companies that are under 100, we're at around 200 at the moment. I've hired about 60 people this year. Then there are companies like Amazon, where you've got somebody who's working in, potentially a warehouse, or just has a different type of job, looking to get into more of a corporate role. And I think that in larger organizations, at 150%, I think there should be way more predictive, behavioral testing. I think that there should be a lot more around, not only like getting people to apply, but really having them be seen through the process. And that's something from a candidate experience perspective that's incredibly important, I think, for large companies. I think for smaller companies, it becomes a little bit more complex, because as Mark had mentioned, the idea of having an internal employee take the test to make sure that it's, the reality is, like, if you're hiring a marketing manager, you might not have another marketing manager if you're a fairly lean startup, right? So the idea is and that's why I said at the very beginning, you need to partner super closely with hiring managers, because ultimately they have a really strong understanding of the day-to-day role. They can help you brainstorm around what to build for the actual assessment. But I think it's sometimes impossible to have someone who's, a similar person to benchmark against. And I think in those situations, you need to be really specific around how you're going to grade it once you do end up building something with the partnership with the hiring manager. What I wanted to dig into was feedback, because, like, that's something that I've, worked through in terms of, what do you guys do when you're dealing with like the feedback from the assessment? Let's say it's not necessarily coding where it's a yes or no, like clearly you didn't know how to do SQL, thanks for your time. But if it's more of one of these assessments that's around like a product thing where they built a feature and then they did some wireframes, in theory, how would you kind of bring that back? I know what I would do, but I don't want to sully the waters. I want to see what people do first. In terms of closing out candidates specifically. So let's say they do the assessment, they're not a good fit. How do people generally?
Well, I'll add a question to that. I don't have the answer for you, but whose responsibility is it to assess? Is it the recruiter's job to be assessing? Is it the hiring manager, the hiring team to be assessing? Has that been sort of defined in your process?
Yeah, I mean, in my process personally, we generally have hiring managers look at I partner with the hiring manager. I'll sit down, I'll look at it. They'll look at it. They'll give me their sense. And then if I really feel like they're off base or they're, in the interest of diversity or in the interest of other things, like let's say somebody comes to the process and they might not have a formal college education. So some of the stuff that they're putting in the report wouldn't necessarily be there, but the overall report looks good or the overall assessment looks good, I might push back against a hiring manager theoretically. But I guess in terms of just communication, I'm a very big into being candid and, some level of not radical candor, because that's a little too much, but in terms of kind of calling candidates, I've been fairly open with them and I'll say, look, like there were some typos. There were, this is what we were missing. This is why, because people, again, for candidate experience, they want, just as you would send them potentially parts of the predictive index, as people in the chat have said, there's a ton of information around how to do better, and people want to do better inherently. So I'm just curious. I want to make sure that I'm not giving too much.
So we actually take the reverse approach because unfortunately we live in a litigious society. So we are extra cautious and careful about giving any or too much specific detailed feedback. So we do try to keep it, more general, just to be, err on the side of being more in the, safe zone of not, saying or disclosing anything that could be seen as discriminatory.
So my thought is a couple things. One is provide some feedback, especially if the person has spoken with someone. Then I am huge on, if someone spoke to the candidate, then they should receive a verbal decision either way, not an email decision, right? And what you don't say is, hey, you bombed the assessment, sorry, right? Because again, it's a tool, right? So to both Simone and Roseanne's points, you do need to be cautious as to the feedback, but to give some type of feedback versus, oh, sorry, we decided to move forward with someone else, right? To me, that's an email, only I'm giving it out of my mouth, right? But to say, here is a reason maybe we decided to go with someone else or in a different direction, right? Someone had more skills in a certain area, right? Or the manager really wanted to concentrate on somebody who had more skills in X that unfortunately you don't. Because the candidate may be like, whoa, wait a minute, I do, right? Regardless of the assessment, maybe there's something that's not on their resume or didn't come out in a conversation, but now they can bring it to light. You're like, whoa, wait a minute, you didn't tell me about that, or I didn't see that on your resume. Oh, well, someone told me to take it off my resume. I'm like, what? Kind of thing. So the person can still be in play, but you do need to be cautious and to say, oh, sorry, we're looking for people who are an 80% match and you were only a 35% match, or you were short in this particular skill set or what have you. To Roseanne's point, you really need to be cautious on that, because then it's almost, from an assessment perspective, using it as a rule and not a tool.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a mix. So as long as you sanitize the message from an HR perspective when you're providing feedback that's actually skill relevant, I think that's perfectly acceptable. Now, when you go to subjective based feedback, that can get into that legal ground that Roseanne was hinting at. So If you're talking about specific technology experience that was not demonstrated, that's perfectly fine. And I think most candidates do find that as a positive. You're going to run into someone that does get offended, though. I mean, 95% of people are going to be happy you provided them substantive feedback, because that is not the usual experience they're used to having. And as I've said on one of these panels before, if you can do the opposite of what is considered the average recruiter, you're going to stick out that much more, and people are going to want to work with you.
So somebody mentioned in the comments about doing presentations towards the end of the process. We actually recently added this in as a standard for all our sales and sales engineer roles. And it's really been super helpful, because we've seen that, during the regular interviews, the candidate maybe did a really good job, but when it came time to do a mock presentation, they bombed out. And that is super important for sales roles. And we've actually created a little bit of a scorecard and kind of meet as a team afterward and debrief, and how did they handle the virtual meeting, how did they handle the sales pitch, things of that nature. So that's been another way to assess candidates on the sales side, is by doing that mock panel presentation, and that's been really helpful, and possibly looking to roll that out for other types of roles, but it's been going really well in the sales organization.
And from a assessment perspective, consistency is very important, right? So I saw somebody posted on LinkedIn, I want to say like over the weekend, they were, and I know it was very mockingly, hey, for a position with our company, I'd like you to do a presentation on, and it was a specific project for the company, right? So they were like, hey, free work out of a candidate kind of thing. But just be sure that you're truly using it as an assessment, and that you're consistent in how you use it. Because to Mark's point, you really need to watch your P's and Q's from a legality perspective, because if because of an assessment you decide not to pick a candidate, right, and the candidate comes back at your organization for whatever reason, and they're starting to file concerns, complaints, or charges because they were not selected, you really need to have defensible information, defensible documentation, and it needs to be if you're consistent, it could keep you out of trouble, right? Both in the assessments and the decisions that you're making.
Question for Roseanne. In that sales pitch that your salespeople did, what product were they pitching back to you? Was it Radware, or was it like a widget?
So we prefer them to present Radware, but we provide them with some information. So we provide them with some slides, we provide them with a white paper, and we're not assessing them on their product knowledge at all. It's really just, their presentation style and their communication skills, and how they're carrying a sales meeting, and are they checking all the boxes from how you conduct a sales meeting. So it doesn't really matter what they're presenting. It's more of, how are they presenting?
Yeah. Years back, I did a project at Salesforce.com, and that's what they did. You had to sell Salesforce back to the Salesforce people, which is, I'd never seen that before. I thought it was real interesting, versus sell me this pen that you see in movies and stuff. All right, well, excellent. We've gone over. I think we had a good roundabout discussion. Usually I go my little work through, but we carried on the conversation. Any final thoughts or comments around assessments as a whole? I do personally think it's one of those scenarios in our professional lives that most people are trying to figure it out still. And they're trying to get to that level where you can consult on it to the business versus just they passed or failed. I do think there's an area in TA that having that specialty around this assessment or that assessment or this tech test or what have you, sort of people are working to get that under their belt to be able to go into a company and promote it and manage it and develop it. But any final thoughts or comments around assessments as a whole? I'll go around the clock here on my screen. Mark, I'll go to you first. Any final thoughts or comments?
I think it was a good dialogue. So I think from my side, I'm good.
Roseanne? Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of great topics. It was super helpful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Simone?
Sorry. Yeah, it was great. I feel like we were, I mean, I don't want to echo what everyone else said, but I think we really kind of talked about a wide range of different styles and, the whole process. So yeah, I'm super happy to have been involved.
And Stephen?
Sean, thanks so much for coordinating and organizing and promoting this. I think that, to everybody else's points, first of all, it's great to have a diverse group of panelists to talk about things from different perspectives. And I hope that everybody got a great deal of information. Overall, just remember that if you're going to look at and use assessments, that it is one tool in your hiring and selection toolbox, right? I worked for a company a long time ago that we pulled an assessment and they're like, well, how am I supposed to make decisions? It's a tool and part of what you look at for making those hiring and selection decisions.
Consistency is key.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's very good. With that said, I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.